God, what do I have to do to make my relationships work? This, in its various forms, I hear over and over and over again. I talk to people every day who, for some reason, their relationships just don't work. And they're like so frustrated, they're so angry. And then once we get past that and they start to trust me, they ask me, am I broken? Am I unlovable? Is there something wrong with me? Why am I still single if not? Why can't I just be enough for someone? I want to explain exactly what the problem is and how you can fix it. You see, you're not broken. Your narrative is broken. So what does this mean? All problems are problems of narratives. So you see, like life is just a series of disparate facts. There's the temperature, there's what this person's doing, there's what someone looks like, there's whatever's around us. Everything is just a fact. Now, if you've ever seen the film Rain Man, you can see what it looks like when someone just takes facts literally. So the way that we make sense of the world is by putting it into some context. So we need a story to put all these disparate facts into a context. This gives us some meaning. The problem is when we don't realize that we're choosing a narrative, that we're living by a narrative. So we become trapped inside that narrative because we mistake the story for reality. And all emotional pain is a clashing of reality with your story of reality. So the real problem for most people for relationships is that the cultural narrative that we've been given on relationships doesn't work. People think that their relationships failure, it has been due to them. They feel there's something wrong with them, or they think it's their ex. But I want to show you what this cultural narrative is and why it's so damaging and toxic for our relationships. But in order to do this, we can't just take relationships as we understand them, because otherwise we're taking all the ingredients that are damaged, that are creating the problem, and we're just adding something into it. And this is one of the problems that happens a lot in relationship counseling, in relationship books and courses, is that people are working from a basis that just doesn't work. So the solution is we have to break everything down into what the actual facts are, because then we're dealing with reality. Then we can build on truth. So then we build a narrative that works better. So this might seem like a little bit of a ramble and like I'm going off in different directions, but I'm going to wrap it up because there's lots of different parts of this, and they're all key in order for you to be able to understand that this isn't really like one big problem, it's one mesh of little problems. So it's clear that relationships, as we do them, as a society, don't work. And people feel a sense of shame, a sense of blame, a sense of failure when their relationships don't work. But when there's a divorce rate of 1 in 2, you can see that's not an individual problem. That's a systemic problem with relationships. If we're going to take the divorce rate as a means of measuring committed relationships, that's been skyrocketing since the 40s and the 50s. And this is really important. We need to understand why this is, because this shows us what the narrative about relationships has always been. And so it shows us what what is laid down deeply in our culture and cultural beliefs about relationships. So we're going to have to look back at history. Now, in the same way that we look at our pets and we assume that they feel what we feel, that they view life as we do, we look back at our ancestors from centuries ago and assume, because we never really think about it that much, but we assume that life for them was pretty much like the life we live, that their experience was like our experience. But the reality is that life was very, very different for them. Physical survival was a daily battle. So the welfare state here in England only began its most basic forms in the early 1910s, 1920s. So if we go back 150 years, I think it was about, on average, that average parents would lose maybe 3 or 4 children. Life was just struggle. It was just about survival. And so marriage and family has been a practical arrangement for economic survival. Because if you don't have Tesco's, if you don't have anyone that's going to bail you out when you're stuck, you need a strong unit. Because however strong you are, you get cold, flu, you get some kind of sickness and you're going to be out. Who's going to be there for you? The actual marriage is a practical arrangement. Children, people had children so that they could send them out to work, so that they could help out on a farm. So life was very different. Now, back then, the two authorities that people listened to were the government and the church. And both of these gained their power and belief from people when society was working. And so they needed couples to stay together. And this is why ingrained in our culture is the whole family values. And family values matter because without that narrative, without that pressure, society would crumble. And then the government, the church would lose their authority, because when there's anarchy, we've seen in the coronavirus that when people lose faith in the institutions of society, there becomes anarchy and people just look out for themselves. So if you didn't have the family unit, back then the society would have crumbled. And so there's laws and there's religious doctrines that come from the motivation of wanting to everyone to be a productive and functional member of society, which meant heterosexual and married. And so this is why there's such a deep sense of shame in being single, because people that today don't have to say anything to you for you to, or do anything, or even look at you in any way for you to feel that shame. That shame is inside, and it's laden down from everything we've been told from children, because our stories, like our values, our laws, everything is deeply embedded in the language. It's embedded in just our perspectives on things. And so there's this sense of shame in being single. There's a sense of shame in being homosexual, being anything out of the cultural norm, because there's this bias and this social pressure that's deeply laden into the language, into the social structures, into our psyche. And as far back as history goes, we've lived in a patriarchal society. So society is structured in order to ease men's fears. Women have a natural biological advantage because you always know if the child is yours. So traditionally, the deep relationship fear of a man is to be cuckolded, is his wife to cheat on him and him to be the fool that's raising another man's child. And so there's been all this kind of control of women, segregating women from men. treating them as a lesser gender, taking away their ability to have their own money, to vote, making them hide away in veils for the pressure not to be a slut, the pressure not to seem overly interested in men, not to seem like you like sex. So women were made dependent on men. They weren't given the same opportunities or freedoms. And all of this played into the idea that the man had to be head of the household. So there's all this kind of toxic pressure on women to be good and submissive, and on men to always have the answer. Because for a man to be questioned in his own household shows that he's not man enough. And so what this does is this creates a culture that encourages control, coercion, and it allowed abuse for years. And even today, we can see how this is laden in, because if you look at sexual desires, women typically want a dominant man. They want someone that makes them feel safe and feminine. But what if the dominant man, the head of the household, the one making all the decisions, was an idiot, leading them astray? What if he didn't know what was best? So women had to put up with it, at least on the surface. But there's always a way. And women found their power and influence in manipulation. So we've got men who are refusing to discuss their thoughts or their thinking or their feelings, because that would show, that would look like insecurity, that would look like weakness. And you've got women never saying actually what they mean or showing their true motivation. So where do we think the problem of communication in relationships might stem from? Why would anyone trust when that is the basis of a relationship? Now, before we move on to the issues in marriage today, we have to consider another reality of relationships, which basically meant marriage before the 20th century. So before the Industrial Revolution completely changed the landscape of the world, most of the population lived in small rural villages, and there was typically 150 people or less. And they'd rarely leave their village and rarely meet anyone except from like the storytellers and the people who would come to sell things. So think about that, 150 people across all ages. How many people do you think there would be for potential eligible partners? It's definitely going to be less than you could swipe away in one evening in Tinder. So if there's only 10 or 20 people being on the entire prospective dates on an app, you'd write the app off. So people's expectations and their options for marriage were dramatically different to today's dating. This doesn't mean that there's too many options for dating. It doesn't mean that we should only have a limited pool, because you can't put the genie back in the box. What's gone is gone. But what it means is that we have all these options, but we're not built to know how to cope with all these options. Just options in general, in general, make us stressed. We aren't happier the more options we have. There's a limit. What this means is that built-in evolutionary through evolution, there's a limit to how many people we can care about. There's a limit to how many people we can know about. And we're built for those small villages still, and towns already overwhelm us. This is why nobody talks on the tube or the subway, because we don't know how to deal with that many people. So what happens on dating sites when there's every kind of choice that you could look for? We treat people like commodities, like something we're ordering from Amazon. And so dating becomes depersonalized, it's desensitized, and it's demoralizing. And so feelings get hurt. people feel rejected. And all of this leads to a lack of trust, which leads to a toxic dating culture. As we become more prosperous as a society, survival becomes less important. Feelings, freedom, happiness become more important. And so bit by bit, women have become more equal. Now, as soon as women are no longer tied to their husband, when they have the option of leaving, most of them are. So the divorce rate skyrocketed when survival was less important and freedom and feelings and personal happiness and emotional well-being mattered more. So why would anyone stay in an unhappy situation when you don't have to? So the failure of marriages today is more an indictment of the traditional model of relationships than it's a sign of our fickleness. People do look for instant gratification, and some relationships are ruined by an unwillingness to work. Most couples probably have more to gain from staying together than splitting. It's a problem of the narrative, it's a problem of the expectations, it's a problem of not knowing how to fix it. So there's a lack of awareness of solutions and the foundations that need to be in place in order that our relationships have more resilience. You see, the problems that we face in relationships is that we have an entirely new reality for relationships, and it's one that we've got no narrative for. No one's ever taught us how to do relationships because no one's ever needed to consider it. It's a new problem. You know, society, schools, government, they're concerned with what makes money, with what keeps society functioning. They're not concerned with your personal happiness. But it also comes down to as humans, we're hopelessly inept at knowing at what motivates us, at what makes us do what we do, and which of our choices are going to be successful and which of them we're just following blindly because we hope that it will happen. You see, at every wedding, there's almost always an older family member or friend that tries to share their wisdom and their experience. Almost universally, like the happy couple, they smile and they say, yes, I know that is, but we're perfectly compatible and we're so in love and we communicate so well. But half the couples that say that in 10 or 20 years are going to be sitting in a divorce court. We create the narrative based on whatever we feel at the moment. So when we're happy in love, it's because of how compatible we are and how right we are and how generous and kind we are to each other. When we're sitting in a divorce court putting blame, it's because of how incompatible we are and how the other person's behavior is a shit and just is unreasonable. Now, whenever the narrative is set to fit your emotions, you're going to stray off course and you're going to miss your target. So in the absence of any wiser counsel, our relationship narrative has become what is really the aspiration. You see, before there was all these motivational vloggers and YouTubers telling us about how our relationship should be, storytellers were telling us about how love and marriage could make us happy ever after. And there's many reasons why marriages are a cause for celebration. They joined families, they sealed business deals and family partnerships. They relieved parents of the very real worry of and the burden of providing for a child. And they relieved the shame of having a spinster daughter that no one had wanted to marry. So it's natural that they would be joyous occasions. No one goes into them hoping that they're going to go bad. People go into a marriage hoping it's going to be their happy ever after. And so fairy stories give their aspiration that fitted with the social pressures to marry. Fairy stories are deep down our deepest wish for what love would be like. But a fairy story is the relationship equivalent of hoping that you'll win the lottery. And to be honest, the odds are probably quite equal, because love just doesn't just happen and just stay magical forever. So the fairy tale tells us that when the prince and the princess meet, and they meet the one, and that if the love is true, that they'll fall in love. And then when they slay the dragon, or they defeat the wicked witch, or whatever it is, or unbreak the spell, they're going to live happily ever after. But the reality is that relationships aren't like that. So there's 4 lessons that the fairy tale teaches us. So objectively, we all know that the fairy tale is just a story, but we have to look at, how do we operate? And how we operate is based on all the it's an aggregation of all the messages we've taken and we've laid in, and we believe are true. And now when you understand that 70% of all the thought processes you have are laid down and set by the age of 7, then you start to recognize that the reason people behave so immaturely in relationships is because of emotions, but it's because their emotions hijack, and it plays on all the deep frameworks that we have of how a relationship works. So let's look at the 4 lessons of the fairy tale, and I'm going to try and show you how this works. I see this because I've worked 3 decades with people. I've seen people, the one thing people have always wanted to talk about is their relationships. And I've seen the same patterns, unique circumstances, but the same patterns. And everyone thinks they're the first one with the same problem. We all have the same problems. They just look different to us. So the 4 lessons of the 4 lessons of the fairy tale. There's one out there for all of us. Now, if the princess is beautiful enough and the prince competent and gallant enough, they'll fall in love. If the other one is the one, the love that they will have is true, they'll live happily ever after. And therefore, the path to being loved is finding the one and being beautiful and sweet enough for a woman, or dashing and brave enough for a man. So if we look closely at our culture and at our media, you can see that advertisers use this cultural conditioning to sell us perfume, cosmetics, clothes. Look at an advert, and basically what it's telling you is this skin cream is going to make men love you. For men, if you're going to use Lynx, buying the Lynx is going to have hordes of women after you. They're just playing on the conditioning that's already there. When people feel that their relationships are under threat, and when they feel like they're going to hit the dating market again, that's when they hit the gym. That's when they go to have makeovers, new hairstyles, new wardrobes. But the reality is, if you've been together 20 years, your relationship isn't hitting the rocks because you're not wearing the right stuff, because you're not using the right skin cream, because your husband, wife finds you unattractive. Most of the time, the problem is that the connection has gone. It's problems in the relationships where the person doesn't feel the same way in the relationship, so they don't feel the same way about the partner. Even in cases where people say it's because they're not attracted to you, most of the time it's more about how they feel than about looks. But we're operating from this fairy tale model. And so people aren't rationally thinking, they're just feeling emotions and responding to those emotions. So women will go for makeovers. Women will go to the gym. Men will also go to the gym, but men, it's more about being powerful, being competent, being strong. And so for them, it's about their status. Yet the source of relationship problems usually isn't the people in them. Because people, yes, people will cheat, people will treat others badly, people will switch off, people won't communicate, people won't tell the truth. But this is because the way the relationship's framed, they don't feel safe. This is the way that people react when they're unhappy. Usually when we're unhappy with someone, we don't tell someone why we're unhappy. We have digs at them. So people argue over the cap on the toothpaste, the toilet seat being left up, over money, over parenting. And often the problem isn't really the problem that they're arguing about. What they really want to say is, you did this that hurt me, and so I'm going to get back at you. People that are trying to provoke. How relationships disintegrate, how they crumble, and how they fail is often the reasons that we think of why they fail, like being incompatible, growing apart, people cheating or being unreasonable. Often that is a symptom of how someone's feeling in the relationship. So we can be perfectly compatible, and I can love the things that are different about you when we get together. And then 5-10 years, I hate those things. And it's not really those things. It's the fact that the connection with your partner is gone. You resent the partner, and so you resent the differences. So the real issue is the connection. The way we're set up in relationships is setting us up for disappointment. It's setting us up to be bitter, and it's setting us up to fight. But there is a better way. It starts with an understanding that all relationships are going to have problems. I think Dan Weil has the perfect quote where he says, when you marry someone, you marry a set of problems. If you didn't marry this person, you wouldn't have these problems, but you'd have a different set of problems. So when you marry someone whose problems that you can live with. So no two people, however alike you think you are, however much in common you think you have, no two people have exactly the same vision or a view of life. And so there's going to be differences on everything, but it's how we deal with those differences. You see, when you look at religions, there are 30,000 plus denominations of Christianity, 30,000 plus denominations of Buddhism. This is because people who subscribe to the same doctrine, the same dogma, can't agree about the little things. There's no magical chemistry or compatibility that are going to make two people especially right for each other. There's people that can't stay in the same room for 10 minutes. So yes, there's a spectrum of people that are more likely for you to get along with, but it's essentially an algorithm that the more ready you are for a relationship, the more emotionally stable you are for a relationship, the more clear you are on the relationship dynamics and how you create a relationship, the more people you could potentially have a loving, fulfilling, satisfying relationship with. The less emotionally stable you are, the less able you are to communicate well, to say what you feel, the less able to know how to make a relationship work, to know what a relationship should look like and how you fix it, the less people you have that you could make a relationship work with. So the more realistic your expectations of a relationship, the more chance it has of working. And the real problem of the fairy tale is when they tell us that there's one out there. So people fall in love after 10 years of friction. They don't treat each other the same because they don't love each other the same. They no longer have that feeling for the other one. They don't treat each other the same way that they did. And so people say, well, if he does this, he mustn't be the one. They think, he's not the one. I need to go and find another one. But then the same thing happens with the next one. No one is going to eternally love you unconditionally. The whole myth of unconditional love is, if you really think about it, it's just impractical. When we know someone's been beaten, when we know someone's been abused, when we know someone's been hurt, destroyed by their relationship, we tell them to get out. Where is unconditional love then? Unconditional love means I'm going to give you everything regardless of how you treat me. And none of us are capable of that. You know, it's been studied. They call it agapic love, the kind of love where you just love someone unconditionally regardless of how they treat you. And that is not how relationships work. That's the fantasy. We all want to be loved like that. But the reality is, we human, we have feelings. When we feel rejection, if we don't feel we're getting back the same love that we give out, our love isn't going to sustain. So the one is a key way the fairy tale myth has damaged our relationships. The idea of fate means that people are waiting around for someone to walk in to rock their world. Well, someone's going to rock your world because you have chemistry, because you lust after them, because they're so attractive, because they love bomb you, and you get swept away in it. But that's not how a stable, happy, and satisfying and sustainable relationship is going to last. So I want to give you an alternative framework. And these are the 4 real truths of relationships. And this is the basis that leads to successful relationships. In all my work, I have never come across a couple that have lived out the fairy tale dream. There's people who've met, who've got together with their childhood sweetheart, and they've been happy for 30, 40 years. But it was never the way that the fairy tale told you. It was always work. It was a couple that were willing to talk to each other, a couple that were able to keep that bond, so that whenever events happened, they stood together. Whereas for most people, they're insecure, they're anxious in their relationship, and so when things come apart, it drives a wedge between them. So these are the 4 truths, the 4 relationship truths that are at the basis of all happy and sustainable relationships. The relationship truth number 1 is that relationships are a struggle. The cause of our struggle, the cause of relationship struggles are our narrative. If we can end the struggle if we let go of the narrative, and we overcome the struggle when we build a relationship on truth. So what these truths tell us is that we should expect to work at our relationships. Relationships are successful when we manage so what these 4 truths tell us is that relationships are going to be work. It's not always going to be sunshine and rainbows. We're going to have to overcome our differences to understand each other and to build that cooperative basis. It tells us that we're operating from a narrative, that the reality that we interpret, the reality that we assume that someone's doing something because they don't love us, because they don't care, because you've told them 10 times and they're still doing it, therefore they obviously don't care. All of these things, are narratives. Like, there's no good men about, women are only after money. All of these are narratives. And when we get past the narrative, we have the capability of finding someone, of making a relationship work. So the struggle, whatever struggle you face in relationships, whether you're in a relationship and then you're not very happy, whether your relationships keep ending, whether you can't find the right person, whether you're getting into relationships with the wrong person, whether you've been hurt and you don't know whether to trust again, all of these are narratives. So what we have to do is we have to break down. We have to, first of all, be aware. What is the narrative we're working from? And break down the elements. What's true and what's narrative? And then we build from the elements, but we build a narrative that works. We change the narrative as soon as reality shows us that our narrative isn't true. If you build your relationships on the 4 relationship truths, you can build a sustainable, lasting, and satisfying relationship. If you build a relationship on the fairy tale model, which pretty much everyone does, it's almost certainly doomed. If you build a relationship on the fairy tale model, your relationship is built on like a house of cards. You're dancing on a volcano, and at any given moment, when something happens, when something triggers it off, it will all come crumbling down. The only sustainable base is by building on the truth.